Hi everyone, it's Matt at Dungeon Crawl Minis, and welcome back to another painting video. Today we are going to be painting one of my favourite D&D monsters of all time, which is the Shambling Mound by Nolzur's Marvellous Miniatures. Here's what he'll look like when we're done. Let's take a look at the paints we'll need. For priming and zenithal highlighting, we will be using Stynylrez Black Primer, Vallejo Cold Grey, and Liquitex White Ink. Following that, we'll be using Vallejo Game Air, Dark Green, the lovely named Sick Green, and Goblin Green. Next, we'll be moving into Scale Colour with Boreal Green and Irati Green. For the mushrooms, we'll be using Deep Red and Aldebaran Red by Scale Colour and Bone White. For the shadows, we'll be using Dela and Rowney but Umber Ink. We'll be using the Carroburg Crimson Wash by Citadel. And to apply some final highlights, we'll be coming back in with Vallejo Model Colour Green Grey. I've primed it black with my airbrush, and this is a Badger Patriot 105. It is a very solid workhorse of an airbrush, pretty good for priming and base coating, things like that. I will be coming in with the Cold Grey next, and just spraying this down at about a 45 to 60 degree angle. The aim is to leave the shadows of the mini mostly untouched. We'll be mirroring the light as if it was hitting the model from overhead. Or when the sun is at its zenith, hence the name zenithal priming. So once the cold grey has been applied, we can spray with white ink just straight down from above, which unfortunately I forgot to film. But the easiest way to apply this is to tilt the mini towards you at a 90 degree angle and just apply the white ink over the top. Once that's dry, we can come in and start applying the base colours. For these greens, I'll be using a different airbrush, which is the Sotar 2020, also made by Badger. This is really used for detail work, but I find that I have a little more control with it than with the 105, so I'm going to be using it from this point forwards. And we'll be coming in with the dark green colour from Vallejo Air. Now this is quite transparent, as you can see, and I really just want to apply this over the whole model. I'm also making sure to tilt the mini and spray everything, including the shadows, because we want to really get that green in. Next, we'll be coming in with Sick Green, delicious, and spraying this down at again about a 45 to 60 degree angle, just to bring out some of those highlights a little bit more. Finally, we will come in with Goblin Green directly from above. Next step is to tint these shadows, and I didn't really like the black that was going on here, so I brought in the burnt umber ink, and I'm just going to apply this neat, undiluted through the airbrush, and just spray this from below, so point it away from you and just spray the ink, making sure we hit all of the shadows. The final step is to get some more highlights onto the Shambling Mound, so we will move into the Green Grey by Vallejo. I'm going to thin this using Flow Improver at a ratio of about 4 or 5 to 1. Exactly how much is going to depend on the environment that you're in. And to apply this as the highlight, we'll just tilt the mini towards us and then gently spray through the airbrush. Next, we'll go to wash it, so we'll take the Carroburg Crimson and just apply this really well all over the mini. A red wash on a green mini might not have been my first choice, or necessarily the most obvious, but what it should do is push the shadows into a brown and leave some interesting complementary colours on the rest of the figure. So with the wash applied, I'm just going to go back in and try to wick off some of that excess. The next step is our first dry brush, so we are going to come in with Boreal Green by Scale Colour. I'll get a little bit on the makeup brush and then just get rid of almost all of it, as you can see here. Just going to go over almost all of the figure with this colour just to try and get a real mix of shades and hues of green in here. Now, I'm going quite heavy on the dry brush here because I really want to bring a lot of colour back. Green can be fairly transparent, and in fact, as it turned out, the dry brush alone wasn't enough to give me the highlights that I wanted, so now I'm coming back in just with the detail brush and some of the thinned down paint, and applying highlights manually. I'm picking out areas like some of the larger vines, the leaves, things like that, areas that I just feel needed a little bit more colour. Areas of note here include the main arm that is extended and the facial area, if it can be called that. I'm not sure it really has a face, but there we go. The next step is mixing 1 or 2 drops of the burnt umber ink into this green, and that will give us an in-between colour that we can then come in and work into some of these shadowed areas, make them a little bit more visually interesting, add some colour variance in here, because otherwise it's just going to be all a flat brown and is going to be pretty boring. With the same colour, I'm also going back to the main area of the mini and picking out a few of the larger vines that I think would be a little bit more interesting. Again, just building on that colour variance as before and making things a little bit more interesting to the eye. Next, I decided it was time for a few more highlights, and the green just wasn't popping enough for me, so I'm coming back in here with Irati green and just applying that in a thinned out coat. You can see I put a little bit too much on the mini there, so I just came in with my finger while the paint was still wet and wiped it off. This is actually the colour that I'll be using to pick out all of the leaves on the miniature eventually, just so that, again, there's a little bit more colour variance and we have these bright pops of green occasionally showing throughout the mini. Now I'm coming in with the Irati green, picking out the leaves that I may have missed earlier and just adding a little bit more visual interest to the model. With that done, it's time to paint the mushrooms. These will be red, and I tried to apply this over the dark green coat, but it just wasn't working and the red paint's too transparent for this to work. So I came in with a brown. Any brown that you have will do just fine, and I'm applying this first. Then we can work up to red and it should make life much easier. Once that's dry, we can come in with the scale 75 deep red. This will be our base coat for the mushrooms. We'll come in later with a highlight. At this point, I'm also going to block out the teeth with the brown colour as well. These will eventually end up a bone white colour. Bone because Shambling Mounds eat a lot of humans and it seemed like an appropriate colour choice. The next step is to highlight the edges of the leaves with green-grey and also pick out these horrible blisters or pustules that are on the surface of the figure. Again, this will take a couple of coats to cover just because the underlying coat is quite dark. So I'm going in here, I'm being quite gentle and almost stippling the paint on to make sure that I only hit the areas that I really wanted. You can see here I missed a couple of leaves, so I'm bringing the Irati green back in, and once that's dried I will just highlight the edges with the green-grey. The next step is to come back in and we are going to put a highlight on the mushrooms. For this we are going to be using Aldebaran Red from scale 75 and just 2 thin coats over the top. I stepped back and took another look at this point and the shadows weren't quite deep enough, so I decided to come back in with more of the brown ink and just apply this a little bit more liberally across the figure. Once it's dry, we should have, again, even more colour variance than we had before, and to pull out some of those details. The next step is to apply some dots onto our toadstools using bone white paint. And this is pretty simple, you just get a little bit on the brush, wipe off the excess, then I come in, I brace my arm on the table, brace the brush with another finger, and just very gently bring in, do one dot, and then pull away, and do the next. At the same time, I'm going to apply the bone white to the teeth as well. At this point, it's almost done, but I took this out from under the painting light that I use, which is quite bright, and I looked at it under more normal, that is, lighting conditions, and the highlights still were not quite pale enough for what I wanted. So I decided to do one final pass on it with the airbrush. So again, this is with the green-grey paint, thinned about 4 or 5 to 1 with Flow Improver. And I'm just coming back in with the 2020 airbrush and just applying these spot highlights very, very carefully, as you can see here. Very light coats, not very heavy at all. I apply a highlight, come back in if it's not quite enough. And with that, he is completed. So I hope you found this useful. Again, please let me know in the comments if there's anything else you'd like to see or know more about. And as always, thank you for watching.